I can't take chances. If the outsiders are in this, it's a dangerous business. You can go in if you want, but we're not waiting more than half an hour for you to get out." Ryanson met his gaze steadily for a moment, then nodded brusquely. "All right." He turned and moved into the overhanging shadows of the mountains, towards the ancient alien city. He stayed in the shadows as he approached the walls of the fortress, darting quickly across exposed ground. The Hurlogi were large and powerful. Physical battle with them was, of course, out of the question. But he had some things on his side. He was small, and therefore less likely to be seen. He was faster than the quiet, aged aliens, and he knew the city, the fortress, and the temple almost as well as they did. Perhaps better, in fact, for his purposes. For while he had shared Tebron's mind, he had been not only Tebron, but also Ryanson, Earthman. A corner of his mind had been alert and aware, hearing the distant screams of Hurong, wondering about the design of the altar of Kor. And he had seen other things when he looked through Tebron's eyes. When the ancient warlord had stormed the city fortress, there had been an observer in him who had said, "An Earthman could go in this way, unobserved. A smaller attacker could slip through here, could conceal himself where no Hurlogi could reach." He arrived at last at the base of the wall where the blunt rocks of the mountains tumbled to a dead end against flat, weathered stone. So far he must not have been seen. There had been no disintegrator beams fired at him, no leather Hurlogi heads watching from the walls. He flattened against the stone and raised his eyes to the barriers. The wall here had been built higher than the portions which faced the flat, and it was stronger. No one had tried to storm the city from this position, because it was too well protected. But the walls had been built against the heavy, clumsy bodies of the grey aliens. With luck, a man could scale this wall. The footholds in the weathered stones would be precarious, but perhaps it could be done. And the Hurlogi, who regarded this wall as impregnable, would not be guarding it. Sighting upwards from flat against the wall, he chose his path quickly and began to climb. The stone was smooth but grainy. He dug his fingers into narrow niches and pulled himself slowly upward, bracing himself with footholds wherever he could. It was laborious, painful work. Twice he lost handholds and hung precariously until his straining fingers again found some indentation. Sweat covered him. The wind from the flat whipped against the wall and touched the moisture on his back coldly. But his face was set in a frozen grimness, and though his breath came in gasps, he made no other sound. When he neared the top, he suddenly seemed to reach a dead end. The stones were smooth above him. His arms ached, his shoulders seemed deadened. He clung numbly to the wall and searched for another path. When he found it, he had to descend 10 feet and move to the right before he could reascend. As he retraced his route down the wall, he noticed blood where his torn fingers had left their mark, but he could not feel the pain in his fingers. At last, when the wall had come to seem a separate world of existence which was all that he would ever know, a vertical plane to which he clung with dim determination, hardly knowing why any longer, at last he reached the top. His groping hand reached up and found the edge of the wall. His fingers grasped it gratefully, and he pulled himself up to hang by both hands and survey the interior of the fortress. A deserted floor stretched before him, shadowed by the late afternoon darkness which crept down from the mountains to rest on the aged remains of the city. 40 feet down the walkway he saw stairs descending, but his head swam, and all he could focus on clearly was the light film of dust and sand, which covered even this topmost level of the city, blown in shallow drifts against the walls which rose a few feet above the floor here. There were no footprints in that dust. No one had walked here for thousands of years. Wearily he pulled himself over the last barrier and fell numbly to the floor, where he lay for long minutes fighting for breath. His lungs were raw. The thin air of the planet caught and rasped in his throat. His hands were torn and bleeding, and the knife scar over his right eye had begun to throb, but he ignored the pain. He had to clear his head. Eventually he was able to stand, swaying beneath the dark sky. Below him he saw the city, broken and dim, empty streets winding below fallen walls and pillars. Mara's flyer lay shattered against one of those broken walls. Seeing it, he wondered how badly she had been hurt. He moved towards the stairs and descended them slowly. The stairs of the city were as he had remembered them from Tebron's memories, and yet not the same. To the earthman they were steep. The steps were like separate levels, 3 feet across and almost 4 feet deep. His legs ached at each step as the shock of his weight fell on them. He reached the bottom level and paused in the doorway onto the street. It was empty, but he had to think a moment before he could remember his bearings. Yes, the temple was that way, somewhere down the dusty street. He moved through the deeper shadows at the base of the building, remembering. Tebron had taken this city at the head of a force of warriors. To him it had been large and majestic, a place of power and knowledge. But Ryanson, moving wearily through the dust of the ages which had fallen upon the city since the ancient king, found it not merely large, but huge, not majestic, but futile, and the power and knowledge which it once had held was but a dusty shadow now. Somewhere ahead, in the temple, the survivors of that ages-old culture were trying to bring the city to life again. With or without the outsiders, he felt, they must fail. They really wanted to bring themselves back to life, to reawaken their minds, their dreams, their own power, but they tried to do it with memories, and that was not the way. No one was guarding the temple. Ryanson went up the steps as quickly as he could, vaulting from level to level, trying to stay in the shadows, listening for movement. But sounds did not carry in the air of Herligy. The aliens would not hear him approaching, but he might not hear any of them either until he stumbled upon them. At the top of the stairs he darted into the shadows of the colonnade which surrounded the interior. Doorways opened at intervals of 50 feet around the building. He would have to circle to the side and enter there, if at all. He slipped quickly between the columns and paused at the third doorway. He dropped to the floor, lay flat on his chest, and looked inside. They were all there, 24, heavy gray aliens, sitting, standing, staring quietly at the floor. There was little movement among them, but nevertheless he could feel the excitement which pervaded the temple. No, not excitement, anxiety, fear. Watching those huge bodies huddled into themselves, he heard an echo of Harong's screams in his mind. These creatures were afraid of battle, of conflict, and yet they had thrust themselves into a fight which they must lose. Did they know that? Could they believe what the machine of the outsiders had told them, after it had been proven fallible? The eye of Kor glowed dully in the dark inner room. 2 of the Herligy stood silently before it, watching, waiting. But the religion of Kor had played no part in their lives of the Herligy for generations. Now that the ancient muddled religion had been brought to life again, could it have the same hold on them that it once had? Mara was on the floor of the temple, leaning with her back against the wall. One of the doorways from the outer colonnade was nearby, but 5 of the Herligy surrounded her. And with a start, Ryanson noticed that her left arm hung limp and twisted at her side, and blood showed on her forehead. Her face showed no emotion, but as he watched, she raised her right hand to run fingers through her long dark hair nervously. She had not seen him, but she was waiting. When he made his move, she would follow him. Ryanson slipped back from the doorway and circled the building again until he had reached the entrance nearest the girl. He drew out his stunner from its holster and looked at it for a moment. He would have to be fast. His weapon would give him no advantage against the disintegrators of the Herligy, but surprise and speed might, and perhaps fear. He broke around the corner of the doorway at a dead run, firing as he went. 2 of the Herligy fell before they could even turn. They crumpled to the floor heavily. Then he screamed, a high scream, like Harong's, and as loud as he could make it, a wail, a cry of anguish and terror and pain. They felt it, and it touched a response in them. The Herligy who surrounded Mara twisted to look at him, but they instinctively shrank away. He continued to fire, bringing down 3 more